More than 300 million years ago, Earth's atmosphere held more oxygen than at any other point in complex life's history. In some regions, it may have risen above 30%. The air itself was different. Forests spread across lowland continents near the equator. They were not built from oak or pine, they were constructed from towering plants that no longer exist. Some rose more than 100 feet into humid skies. Their trunks were patterned and columned. Many were soft at the core. Their roots did not anchor deeply. They formed shallow networks in waterlogged ground. Stability came from density, not strength. When these giants died, decay failed to keep pace. Microbes had not yet evolved the tools to fully dismantle lignin-rich tissues. Trunks collapsed and accumulated in vast layers. Carbon was buried instead of returned to the air. Over time, atmospheric chemistry shifted. Oxygen climbed higher. Insects expanded beyond modern limits. Some dragonflies reached wingspans wider than seabirds. Fire behavior changed as well, fed by air that carried more oxidizing power than today. This was not a gradual adjustment. Entire ecosystems reorganized around abundance and accumulation, and then the pattern reversed. Oxygen declined, wetlands contracted, the giants shrank and disappeared. What remained hardened underground. Hundreds of millions of years later, humans would extract those compressed remains and burn them for energy, releasing ancient carbon back into circulation. But what allowed trees to grow so tall in the first place? Why did decomposition lag behind growth for so long? How did excess oxygen reshape life on land? And why does modern civilization still depend on the buried residue of that vanished world? Tonight, we explore the forgotten age of giant trees. But before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to think of these stories being heard across so many different skies. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into Earth's distant past, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and together, let's step into the world that once grew taller than any forest we know today. Before trunks rose into misted air and reshaped the chemistry of continents, the land itself lay exposed beneath a thinner veil of green. In the long stretch of the Silurian and into the early Devonian, Earth's continents were broad, quiet expanses of stone and sediment, their surfaces only lightly softened by living film. Along river margins and tidal flats, low plants clung close to the ground, forming modest carpets that rippled in damp wind. They did not yet command the horizon. They traced it. Most vegetation remained small because the physics of standing upright had not been solved. Without rigid internal support, cells filled with water could only lift themselves so far before collapsing under their own weight. Gravity pressed downward with patient insistence, and every inch of height required a system capable of resisting that pull. Early land plants possessed little more than simple tissues that moved water slowly from cell to cell. Moisture traveled by diffusion and capillary action, effective across millimeters, unreliable across anything larger. When air dried and sunlight intensified, their upper surfaces desiccated quickly, forcing them to remain close to the damp ground, where evaporation was slower and survival more certain. Soils were shallow and immature, formed from the gradual weathering of bare rock. Without deep roots to fracture stone and anchor sediment, landscapes eroded easily under rainfall. Nutrients washed away before they could accumulate. The partnership between plant and earth had not yet deepened. Each organism lived within narrow margins of stability, dependent on constant access to surface moisture. Within these limitations, a quiet innovation began to unfold. Certain lineages developed strands of specialized cells that strengthened their stems and conducted water more efficiently. Lignified walls stiffened these conduits, allowing them to resist collapse as water was drawn upward. This vascular tissue formed continuous channels from root like structures to photosynthetic tips, transforming the internal architecture of plants. Height became mechanically possible, not merely aspirational. With improved transport came new relationships with light and air. Leaves could be lifted above neighboring growth, intercepting more sunlight and releasing oxygen into moving currents. Roots, extending deeper into sediment, stabilized soil and accessed minerals beyond the reach of surface mats. The land responded in turn. Rock fractured more readily, organic matter accumulated, and thin soils thickened into something capable of holding memory. The shift was not sudden, yet it marked an irreversible turning. Plants were no longer confined to hugging the earth. They began to experiment with vertical space, testing structural limits through incremental extension. Each additional layer of supportive tissue represented stored energy and evolutionary risk, but also possibility. In these early vascular pioneers lay the blueprint for forests that would one day tower over swamps and rewrite atmospheric balance. The world before trees was modest and close to the ground, yet within its restrained forms, the architecture of height was already taking shape. Across the floodplains of the late Devonian, a new architecture began to gather form, not in sudden towers, but in patient layers of branching growth that altered the horizon itself. What had once been scattered, stems and cautious height experiments, coalesced into something denser, more interconnected, a living lattice that interrupted wind and filtered light before it ever touched the ground. The land no longer appeared simply inhabited by plants. It began to feel structured by them. Among these early architects stood forms such as Archaeopteryx, neither fully modern tree nor primitive shrub, but something transitional and quietly revolutionary. Its trunk thickened through secondary growth, adding rings of supportive tissue that allowed it to widen year by year. Branches extended outward in complex arrays, bearing leaves that captured sunlight with greater efficiency than earlier lineages. This was not height for its own sake. It was stability, persistence, and the capacity to occupy space in three dimensions over extended spans of time. Beneath the surface, an equally profound transformation unfolded. Roots no longer remained shallow. Threads limited to damp margins, they penetrated deeper into sediment, branching repeatedly, binding particles of mineral and organic matter into cohesive soil. As these roots expanded, they fractured underlying rock, accelerating chemical weathering. Silicates broke down, nutrients were released, clay minerals accumulated. The ground, once thin and easily washed away, began to thicken and hold. Landscapes stabilized under the grip of living networks that anchored riverbanks and reduced erosion. With deeper roots came greater access to water stored below the surface. Vascular tissues transported that moisture upward through xylem conduits strengthened by lignin, allowing leaves to function above the immediate reach of groundwater. The canopy thickened, casting shade that moderated temperature and slowed evaporation. Humidity gathered beneath interlaced branches, creating microclimates where smaller plants and early terrestrial animals could persist in buffered conditions. These forests did not yet resemble later swamp kingdoms, nor did they host flowering plants or birdsong. Their composition was simpler, dominated by spore-bearing lineages and early seed precursors, yet their structural impact was immense. Vertical layering began to define ecological space. Upper foliage intercepted direct sunlight, mid-level branches filtered what remained, and the forest floor received a softened glow. Decomposing litter accumulated between roots, contributing organic carbon to the growing soil profile. Nutrient cycles lengthened, slowed, and deepened. Rivers altered their courses as stabilized banks resisted collapse. Sediment transport patterns shifted. Carbon drawdown intensified as woody biomass expanded across continents positioned near equatorial warmth. The atmosphere responded subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, as photosynthetic output increased. In this emergence of true forests, the land crossed a threshold from scattered vegetation to integrated ecosystem. Height became sustained rather than experimental. Roots stitched terrain into continuity. The surface of Earth, once exposed and easily rearranged, entered a new phase of partnership with life, one in which biological structure and geological process intertwined with enduring consequence. Time advanced into an interval when continents gathered along equatorial latitudes, forming broad belts of low elevation that stretched across the planet's midsection. This span, known as the Carboniferous, unfolded over tens of millions of years, from roughly 359 to 299 million years before the present. Land masses that would one day separate into distant regions lay clustered near the equator, where sunlight was direct and seasons were gentle. The geometry of the planet itself shaped what followed. These continental interiors were warm and persistently humid. Moist air rose from shallow epicontinental seas and drifted inland, releasing frequent rainfall across expansive lowlands. Rivers meandered slowly across flat terrain, spilling into flood basins that remained saturated for much of the year. Water pooled rather than drained, creating landscapes where the boundary between land and marsh blurred into continuity. In such settings, evaporation was balanced by near constant precipitation, and groundwater lingered close to the surface. Temperature gradients remained narrow, limiting frost and extending the growing season across nearly the entire year. Sunlight, abundant at equatorial latitudes, fueled photosynthesis with few interruptions. Atmospheric composition, already influenced by earlier forest expansion, provided elevated concentrations of oxygen while carbon dioxide continued to circulate through active plant uptake. The combination of warmth, moisture, and sustained light created conditions in which growth rarely paused. Biomass accumulated not only in trunks and fronds, but in thick undergrowth and dense root systems that intertwined beneath standing water. Tectonic forces also played a quiet role. As continental plates converged toward the assembly of larger landmasses, mountain building occurred along certain margins, altering wind patterns and redirecting rainfall into interior basins. Sediment eroded from rising highlands washed into lowland swamps, burying organic material under successive layers of silt and clay. Each flood event sealed away fallen vegetation beneath mineral cover, limiting exposure to oxygen and slowing decay. In these tropical expanses, competition for light intensified. Plants that could extend higher intercepted more solar energy, reinforcing selection for vertical growth. The cost of producing supportive tissue was offset by nearly uninterrupted access to water and warmth. Shallow seas bordering the continents moderated climate, reducing extremes and maintaining atmospheric humidity that softened the stress of transpiration. Even minor elevations above the water table offered stable ground for dense stands of vegetation. The Carboniferous world was therefore not defined by a single factor, but by convergence. Continental positioning near the equator concentrated heat and moisture. Persistent wetlands limited decomposition. Sediment burial preserved organic matter. Together, these processes fostered explosive plant expansion across vast tropical lowlands. Forests thickened, peat accumulated, and the surface of Earth entered a phase in which biological productivity reached extraordinary levels, setting the stage for transformations that would resonate far beyond these humid equatorial plains. They did not resemble the forests that would come later. Their silhouettes were unfamiliar, their proportions almost architectural, as if assembled from repeating patterns rather than carved from solid wood. In the saturated lowlands of the Carboniferous, the giants themselves stood in dense formations, rising straight upward before flaring into crowns of narrow leaves that clustered near their summits. Lepidodendron dominated many of these wetlands. Its trunk, often reaching heights well beyond 100 feet, was marked by a lattice of diamond shaped leaf scars that spiraled in disciplined geometry along the bark. These scars were not decorative, but structural memory, traces of leaves that had once drawn sunlight high above the marsh surface. The trunk expanded rapidly during growth, yet much of its strength came from a thick outer rind rather than dense interior wood. Inside, tissues were comparatively soft, composed of supportive fibers surrounding a large central pith. The architecture favored speed over permanence. Sigillaria rose nearby, equally tall yet distinct in form. Its surface bore vertical rows of oval leaf scars arranged in orderly columns, giving the trunk a ribbed appearance that caught light differently as the day shifted. Instead of broad branching networks, many sigillaria maintained a more singular ascent, with foliage concentrated toward the upper reaches. Their presence created a canopy that was both continuous and strangely sparse, allowing filtered brightness to descend through gaps between narrow crowns. Tree ferns added texture to this vertical landscape, their fronds unfurled in wide arcs, each leaflet delicate yet numerous, creating layered fans that softened the rigid lines of lycopsid trunks. Though shorter than the tallest lepidodendron, some tree ferns still reached heights impressive enough to contribute to the upper tiers of the forest. Their growth form was more familiar to modern eyes, yet even they differed from later woody trees in internal structure and reproductive strategy. These giants were not hardwoods in the sense understood today. They lacked the dense secondary xylem that defines oak or maple. Many belonged to ancient lycopsid lineages, relatives of modern club mosses that now persist only as small, ground-hugging plants. In the Carboniferous, those lineages achieved extraordinary scale through a developmental pathway unlike that of seed-bearing trees. Their reproductive cycles relied heavily on spores rather than enclosed seeds, dispersing fine particles into humid air rather than protecting embryos within woody cones or fruit. The result was a forest assembled from forms that combined rapid upward extension with comparatively shallow anchoring systems. Stability arose from crowded growth and saturated ground, rather than deep, penetrating roots. Their biology favored accumulation and swift occupation of space, an approach suited to wetlands where competition for light was relentless and decay lagged behind production. In their unfamiliar design, these giants expressed an evolutionary experiment that would not be repeated in quite the same way again. Height in this ancient world was not an accident of abundance, but the outcome of several forces converging with unusual harmony. The atmosphere itself carried a greater share of oxygen than at most other intervals in complex life's history, altering both combustion and respiration in subtle yet pervasive ways. While oxygen does not directly cause plants to grow taller, elevated concentrations influenced ecosystem dynamics, supporting dense biological activity and shaping the chemistry of decay and fire. Within that enriched air, photosynthetic exchange operated across vast canopies, and metabolic processes unfolded within a system already tilted toward accumulation. More decisive for stature was internal design. The vascular networks that had first appeared in earlier forests became increasingly efficient conduits, transporting water upward through elongated tracheids reinforced with lignin. These channels reduced resistance across height, allowing columns of fluid to rise through cohesion and tension generated by transpiration at the leaves. The physics of water movement, once a strict constraint, became a manageable challenge as conductive tissues thickened and aligned. Each additional meter of elevation required coordinated strength between xylem walls and evaporative pull, a balance achieved through evolutionary refinement rather than brute density. Growth strategy also favored speed. Many Carboniferous giants allocated energy toward rapid vertical extension during early development, prioritizing access to sunlight above structural longevity. Their outer tissues hardened sufficiently to bear weight, yet large portions of their internal anatomy remained relatively soft and spongy. Central pith regions occupied significant volume, surrounded by supportive layers that functioned more like a pressurized cylinder than a solid beam. This arrangement reduced the metabolic cost of constructing dense wood while still enabling impressive height. The environment rewarded such design. Saturated soils and steady warmth minimized water stress, reducing the need for deep, anchoring roots capable of reaching distant aquifers. Instead, many giants spread shallow networks laterally through peat-rich ground, forming mats that intertwined with neighboring plants. Stability emerged from collective density rather than singular depth. In tightly packed stands, trunks supported one another against wind, and the waterlogged substrate dampened mechanical strain. Shallow rooting carried risk, yet in persistent wetlands the danger of drought was low. The trade-off favored rapid colonization of open space following disturbance. When sediment buried fallen trunks and new light reached the surface, spores germinated quickly, and young plants surged upward through humid air. The cycle reinforced itself, selecting for forms that could ascend swiftly, capture light efficiently, and invest minimally in long-term woody reinforcement. Through this combination of atmospheric context, hydraulic innovation, and strategic allocation of tissue, the giants achieved their remarkable scale. They were not constructed like later hardwood trees. They were engineered for a particular climate, a particular chemistry, and a particular moment in Earth's unfolding story, where vertical ambition aligned precisely with environmental opportunity. Air, though invisible, can become a geological force when its balance shifts far enough. During the height of these vast wetlands, the exchange between leaf and sky intensified beyond ordinary bounds. Photosynthesis drew carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and split water within chloroplasts, releasing oxygen as a byproduct of light-driven chemistry. Across immense tracts of equatorial lowlands, countless fronds and narrow leaves participated in this reaction simultaneously, each contributing a small pulse that, over long intervals, accumulated into planetary consequence. Ordinarily, oxygen produced through photosynthesis is balanced by respiration and decay, processes that return carbon to the air while consuming free oxygen. In this era, however, an imbalance emerged. Dense vegetation grew rapidly in warm, saturated conditions, yet fallen trunks and fronds were often sealed beneath sediment before microbes could fully dismantle their lignin-reinforced tissues. Carbon that might have cycled back into the atmosphere became trapped within accumulating peat. With each burial event, the ledger tilted slightly. Carbon was stored below ground, and oxygen remained above it. Geochemical models derived from isotope ratios and charcoal abundance suggest that atmospheric oxygen may have climbed toward levels approaching 30 to 35% during peak intervals of the Carboniferous. Such concentrations altered more than respiration. Combustion thresholds shifted, organic material ignited more readily, and flames propagated with heightened intensity once sparked. Wildfires, though episodic, burned hotter in oxygen enriched air, leaving behind layers of charcoal now preserved in stone. For living organisms, elevated oxygen changed the gradient across respiratory surfaces. In arthropods that relied on diffusion through tracheal tubes, higher ambient oxygen allowed gas to penetrate tissues more efficiently, supporting larger body sizes without the need for circulatory transport of oxygen bound to specialized pigments. Within plant tissues, oxidative reactions proceeded within a chemical environment subtly different from that of later ages, influencing both metabolism and stress response. Breathing such air would not necessarily have felt dramatic to a human visitor, yet the partial pressure of oxygen would have been higher with each inhalation. The scent of damp vegetation and organic decay would have mingled with an atmosphere capable of sustaining vigorous combustion and dense biological activity. Subtle differences in flame behavior, in the way embers glowed and sparks traveled, would have revealed the altered chemistry more readily than sensation within the lungs. This oxygen revolution did not occur in isolation. It was intertwined with burial, with sedimentation, with tectonic rearrangements, and hydrologic persistence. Life reshaped atmospheric composition through cumulative, almost patient excess. Over millions of years, the sky itself became a reservoir, reflecting the productivity of swamps below. The balance between growth and decay had shifted, and in that shift, the composition of the air rose to heights rarely matched again in the long continuity of Earth's history. Above the layered canopies and between the rigid columns of lycopsid trunks, movement traced slow arcs through humid air. Wings shimmered in filtered light, their membranes stretched across elongated veins that caught thermals rising from warm wetlands. In this oxygen-enriched atmosphere, flight itself expanded in scale. The sky did not belong solely to small, fleeting forms. It carried giants. Among the most striking was Meganeura, a griffinfly whose wingspan approached that of a modern seabird. Its body remained slender, segmented, and precise, yet its proportions exceeded those of any dragonfly alive today. Transparent wings beat with steady cadence, each stroke supported by atmospheric conditions that allowed oxygen to diffuse efficiently through its internal network of air-filled tubes. Unlike vertebrates, insects do not rely on lungs or blood-bound oxygen carriers. Instead, spiracles along their exoskeleton open into branching tracheae that deliver oxygen directly to tissues. In environments where oxygen concentration rises, diffusion gradients strengthen, permitting larger body size without sacrificing metabolic efficiency. The same principle extended across other arthropods. Giant millipedes, some exceeding 2 meters in length, navigated the damp understory with deliberate motion. Their segmented bodies rippled as hundreds of legs coordinated across peat-rich ground. Thick exoskeletons protected soft internal tissues, yet growth remained constrained by the need to shed and reform these protective layers. Elevated oxygen eased respiratory limitation, allowing these organisms to attain dimensions rarely feasible under present atmospheric conditions. On the forest floor, life unfolded within a mosaic of fallen fronds, decaying trunks, and shallow pools. Amphibians threaded between root networks, while insects of various lineages occupied niches defined by moisture and shade. The air, dense with humidity, carried the faint vibration of wing beats and the rustle of articulated limbs against organic debris. Without birds to claim aerial dominance, these arthropods encountered fewer predators capable of sustained flight, altering ecological balance in subtle ways. Higher oxygen levels did not alone create gigantism, yet they removed a significant constraint. Body size in insects is limited by the capacity of passive diffusion to meet cellular demand. When ambient oxygen increases, the maximum effective diffusion distance within tissues expands, permitting larger thoraxes and longer abdomens without compromising internal supply. Combined with abundant vegetation and stable climate, these physiological allowances translated into visible scale. The result was a forest atmosphere animated by forms that seem almost improbable through modern eyes. Wings spanned broad intervals between trunks, and segmented bodies advanced through undergrowth with slow assurance. It was a biome in which respiratory chemistry, structural design, and ecological opportunity aligned, allowing arthropods to occupy dimensions that later eras would not sustain. At ground level, where filtered light dissolved into green dimness and moisture clung to every surface, another drama unfolded in steady rhythm. The air near the soil was heavy with vapor, warmed by constant respiration and slowed evaporation. Water pooled in shallow depressions, weaving between thick root networks and spreading across peat that yielded softly under weight. In this saturated understory, life found its own equilibrium. Amphibians flourished within these wetlands, their permeable skin, reliant on moist surroundings for gas exchange, suited an environment where dryness was rare. Broad heads lifted above still water as bodies propelled through channels choked with vegetation. Limbs, sturdy yet sprawling, carried them across floating debris and mud that retained the imprint of each passage. Many species grew larger than their modern descendants, supported by abundant prey and buffered from desiccation by persistent humidity. Eggs, laid in water or damp substrates, developed without the risk of rapid evaporation. Among these early tetrapods, subtle innovation began to surface. Certain lineages developed thicker skin and more efficient lungs, reducing dependence on constant immersion. These forms represent the early reptiles, creatures whose amniotic eggs enclosed developing embryos within protective membranes. This evolutionary step allowed reproduction away from open water, expanding ecological range beyond the wettest margins. Though still modest in size and distribution, these early reptiles signaled a quiet shift toward terrestrial independence. Predator and prey relationships threaded through the swamp in intricate patterns. Large amphibians lurked near pools where smaller vertebrates and invertebrates gathered. Arthropods navigated leaf litter, feeding on detritus and one another, while becoming prey themselves to quick strikes from above or below. Energy moved through the system in cycles defined by growth, consumption, and accumulation rather than rapid decay. Each fallen frond contributed to a thickening layer of organic matter, reinforcing the damp substrate that sustained this web. Dense root mats bound the peat together, creating a surface that appeared stable yet concealed slow movement beneath. Decomposition proceeded in oxygen-limited pockets, generating gases that seeped upward in faint currents. The ground was neither fully solid nor entirely fluid. It responded to pressure with gradual compression, absorbing the weight of passing bodies and closing again in their wake. Such terrain favored organisms adapted to uncertainty, able to navigate unstable footing without reliance on firm ground. Humidity shaped every interaction. Transpiration from towering vegetation fed a cycle in which evaporation returned swiftly as rainfall, maintaining saturation across broad regions. The forest floor rarely dried completely, and seasonal contrasts were muted by equatorial positioning and constant moisture input. Within this enclosed world of shadow and vapor, vertebrate life diversified, experimenting with limbs, lungs, and eggs in ways that would eventually extend far beyond the swamps that first nurtured them. Water determined the pace of this realm. It moved without urgency across low relief terrain, spreading into broad wetlands where currents thinned and sediment settled. Channels divided and rejoined, creating mosaics of shallow pools, saturated flats, and drifting mats of vegetation. In these persistent swamps, the boundary between living growth and fallen debris softened into continuity, and the ground itself became an archive of accumulation. When towering plants shed fronds or collapsed after seasons of rapid ascent, their remains did not vanish quickly into mineral soil. Instead, they settled into waterlogged substrates where oxygen availability was sharply reduced. Beneath the surface, pores within the saturated sediment filled with water, limiting diffusion of atmospheric gases. Microbial communities, dependent on oxygen for efficient respiration, operated under constrained conditions. Decomposition continued, yet at a pace far slower than the rate at which new biomass was produced. This imbalance defined the swamp kingdoms. Each growing season added fresh layers of organic matter, while breakdown lagged behind. Lignin-rich tissues, already resistant to enzymatic attack, persisted within these anoxic pockets. Fungal lineages, capable of fully dismantling complex plant polymers, had not yet diversified to match the scale of production. As a result, fallen trunks, bark fragments, and dense leaf litter accumulated rather than cycling rapidly back into the atmosphere. Slow-moving waters contributed further to preservation. Flood pulses carried fine sediment that settled gently across submerged debris, sealing it beneath thin blankets of silt and clay. With each inundation, another stratum formed, isolating plant material from oxygen and stabilizing it within the peat. Over time, these layers thickened into extensive deposits stretching across equatorial lowlands. What appeared at the surface as tangled undergrowth concealed beneath it a vertical record of seasons stacked upon seasons. Within the peat, chemical gradients shifted. Methanogenic microbes thrived in oxygen pore zones, generating gases that escaped in quiet bubbles through saturated ground. Iron compounds cycled between reduced and oxidized states, depending on subtle changes in water table height. The swamp was not stagnant, but chemically dynamic, a slow reactor in which carbon was stored rather than returned. As debris compacted under its own weight, water was gradually expelled from deeper layers, increasing density and concentrating organic carbon. The transformation from fresh plant matter to peat was incremental, measured not in single events, but in cumulative thickness, accrued across thousands of years. Above, living vegetation continued its upward reach. Below, compressed remains recorded the productivity of generations. These wetlands were kingdoms of retention. Growth exceeded decay, and the surplus settled quietly into the earth. In their saturated soils and unhurried waters, the groundwork for vast carbon reservoirs took shape, layer upon layer, within a landscape defined not by rapid turnover, but by patient accumulation. Within the quiet persistence of these wetlands, an imbalance deepened beneath the surface, subtle yet transformative. The towering vegetation that defined this era relied upon lignin, a complex polymer woven into cell walls to provide rigidity and resistance. Lignin allowed stems to stiffen, vascular tissues to withstand tension, and trunks to rise without collapsing under their own weight. It was a structural triumph, enabling vertical ambition on a scale not previously sustained. Yet this innovation carried an unintended consequence. Lignin is chemically intricate, resistant to breakdown by most organisms. In later periods, certain fungi evolved enzymatic pathways capable of cleaving its dense aromatic bonds, returning carbon efficiently to the biosphere. During the height of these swamp forests, however, that capacity appears to have been limited. Microbial communities could dismantle cellulose and simpler compounds, but lignin rich tissues often persisted. When trunks fell and bark sloughed away, the remaining framework resisted complete decay. The result was a slow accumulation of partially decomposed wood within saturated soils. Oxygen scarcity in waterlogged substrates already constrained aerobic metabolism, and without specialized fungal enzymes, lignin endured as a durable scaffold. Over time, fragments of resistant tissue intermingled with softer plant matter, forming thick deposits that compressed under their own mass. Carbon that might have re entered atmospheric circulation remained instead within buried layers. Paleontologists and geochemists continue to examine the timing of lignin degrading fungi, tracing molecular signatures and fossilized structures to refine this narrative. Some studies suggest that efficient white rot fungi diversified after the peak of Carboniferous coal formation, while others propose a more gradual evolutionary progression. The debate centers on whether enzymatic innovation lagged behind plant structural advances, or whether environmental conditions amplified preservation even where decay mechanisms existed. Regardless of precise chronology, the imbalance between production and decomposition is evident in the geological record. This discrepancy reshaped global carbon cycling. Each year of vigorous growth contributed organic matter faster than it could be fully oxidized. Sediment burial sealed away large quantities of lignin-rich biomass, isolating it from microbial attack. As layers thickened and pressure increased, chemical alteration transformed peat into more carbon-dense forms over immense spans of time. The atmosphere responded indirectly, as reduced carbon burial limited the return flux of carbon dioxide. The Great Rot problem was therefore not a singular failure, but a misalignment between evolutionary innovation and ecological capacity. Plants advanced their structural chemistry. Decomposers had not yet matched that advance at comparable scale. In the slow chemistry of wetlands, that gap persisted long enough to alter planetary balance. What began as a molecular adaptation for height became a driver of long-term carbon storage, embedding vast quantities of ancient sunlight within the earth, awaiting futures far removed from the swamps that first concealed it. Long after the last fronds settled into saturated ground, the transformation continued in darkness, hidden beneath layers that thickened with each passing flood. Peat, once loose and fibrous, became compacted as rivers shifted and delivered fresh sediment across lowland basins. Sand, silt, and clay accumulated above the organic layers, pressing downward with quiet persistence. Water was gradually expelled from the compressed mass, and the texture of the buried plant matter began to change. As burial deepened, temperature increased with depth according to the geothermal gradient. The chemistry of the trapped organic material responded slowly to this rise in heat and to the steady force of overlying pressure. Microbial processes diminished in importance, replaced by physical and chemical alteration driven by compaction and thermal maturation. Peat transformed into lignite, a soft brown coal that retained visible traces of its botanical origin. With further burial and higher temperatures, lignite altered into bituminous coal, darker and richer in carbon, its original plant structures increasingly obscured. Over spans measured in millions of years, This sequence continued in certain regions toward anthracite, a dense, hard coal with high carbon content and fewer volatile compounds. Each stage represented a gradual concentration of carbon as hydrogen and oxygen were reduced relative to the original biomass. The transformation was not abrupt but incremental, unfolding beneath layers that recorded shifting climates and migrating shorelines above. The magnitude of Carboniferous coal deposits reflects the extraordinary balance between production and preservation that characterized those wetlands. Vast equatorial lowlands supported dense vegetation over extended intervals, while subsiding basins created accommodation space for thick peat accumulation. Repeated cycles of growth, burial, and renewed colonization stacked organic rich horizons one upon another. In some regions, these sequences reached impressive thickness, forming laterally extensive seams that would persist through tectonic rearrangements and continental drift. These deposits are not evenly distributed across the globe, but are concentrated in areas that once lay within those humid belts near the equator. As continents shifted over geological time, coal-bearing strata traveled with them, becoming embedded within mountain ranges and sedimentary basins now far from their tropical origins. What appears today as black rock in subterranean seams is the compressed residue of ancient forests that thrived under different skies. The link to modern energy systems emerges from this deep history. Coal extracted from these seams represents stored chemical energy captured by photosynthesis hundreds of millions of years ago. When burned, it releases carbon once removed from the atmosphere during the height of those swamp kingdoms. The cycle, interrupted by burial and prolonged isolation, resumes within a fraction of geological time. In this way, the birth of coal during the Carboniferous continues to influence atmospheric composition and human industry, binding present energy demands to ecosystems long vanished beneath layers of stone. Flame behaved differently under the altered chemistry of this age. In air enriched with oxygen, ignition required less sustained heat, and once kindled, combustion advanced with unusual vigor. Lightning, striking across humid horizons, could transform stretches of vegetation into advancing fronts of fire that moved with intensity unfamiliar to later eras. Even damp fuels, partially saturated from frequent rains, were capable of burning when atmospheric oxygen concentrations supported rapid oxidation. The geological record preserves quiet testimony to these events. Thin layers of fossilized charcoal are embedded within sedimentary sequences associated with Carboniferous wetlands. Under magnification, cellular structures of ancient plant tissues remain visible, their walls carbonized, yet intact enough to reveal their botanical origin. Such charcoal indicates not only the presence of fire, but its recurrence. It suggests that ignition was not rare, despite persistent moisture, and that combustion became an ecological factor woven into the rhythm of these forests. Fire frequency in high oxygen environments can increase because the threshold for sustaining flame is lowered. When atmospheric oxygen rises toward levels approaching 30 to 35%, the energy required to maintain combustion decreases, and flames propagate more readily through plant matter. Experimental studies conducted under controlled conditions demonstrate that materials resistant to burning under modern atmospheric composition ignite more easily when oxygen is elevated. Extrapolated to ancient wetlands during drier intervals, this implies episodes of widespread burning following seasonal shifts or temporary drops in water table. These fires did not simply destroy, they reshaped. Stands of lycopsids and tree ferns, once dense and continuous, were periodically opened by combustion, Ash settled across the surface, altering soil chemistry and releasing nutrients bound within biomass. New growth emerged in the aftermath, colonizing exposed substrates with rapid spore dispersal. In this way, fire contributed to cycles of renewal within ecosystems already characterized by high productivity. Charcoal fragments also played a role in carbon burial. Once formed, charcoal is chemically stable and resistant to further decay. Its incorporation into peat layers added another form of persistent carbon to accumulating deposits. Thus, fire, though fueled by oxygen-rich air, indirectly supported long-term carbon storage by converting portions of biomass into refractory material less susceptible to microbial breakdown. Within this oxygen-enriched world, flame became both agent of disturbance and participant in broader geochemical cycles. It pruned forests, influenced species composition, and contributed to the mosaic pattern of growth across lowland basins. Evidence etched in blackened plant tissues and preserved within rock layers reveals a landscape where combustion and accumulation coexisted, each shaping the other under skies whose chemistry amplified the power of even a single spark. Beneath the stillness of the swamps, the planet's crust continued its slow negotiation, plates advancing with deliberate pressure that no forest could sense, yet every ecosystem would eventually feel. Land masses that had once drifted apart began drawing closer, converging along vast collision zones that would, over immense spans of time, assemble into the supercontinent known as Pangaea. This gathering was neither abrupt nor uniform. It unfolded through incremental suturing, as ocean basins narrowed and continental edges pressed into one another. Where plates met, mountain ranges rose. The collision compressed sedimentary layers, lifting them skyward into newly formed highlands. Uplift altered atmospheric circulation by redirecting prevailing winds and reshaping precipitation patterns. Moist air that once traveled unimpeded across lowlands encountered elevated terrain, releasing rainfall along windward slopes and casting rain shadows beyond. Regions that had known persistent saturation began to experience seasonal contrasts, subtle at first, then more pronounced. These tectonic adjustments also modified the pathways of rivers. As gradients shifted and basins tilted, drainage networks reorganized. Channels that once fed broad wetlands were diverted, cutting new courses toward evolving coastlines. In some areas, subsidence created fresh accommodation space for sediment and peat accumulation. In others, uplift exposed swamp deposits to erosion, interrupting the quiet continuity of organic burial. The assembly toward Pangaea influenced ocean circulation as well. With continents clustering near the equator and extending toward higher latitudes, the geometry of coastlines changed, altering currents that redistributed heat. Variations in oceanic flow affected regional climates, reinforcing dryness in certain interiors while maintaining humidity in others. The balance between evaporation and precipitation, so critical to the persistence of peat-forming wetlands, began to shift unevenly across the landscape. Mountain building introduced additional feedbacks. Enhanced weathering of freshly uplifted rock drew carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through chemical reactions that converted silicate minerals into clays and carbonates. This long-term process influenced global climate, contributing to cooling trends that would later intensify. As temperatures moderated and glacial intervals emerged in parts of the late Carboniferous, sea levels fluctuated, periodically exposing lowland areas that had once remained submerged. These changes did not erase the forests immediately. Instead, they fragmented them. Wetlands persisted in some basins while contracting in others. The once expansive equatorial belts of continuous swamp became mosaics, separated by rising terrain and shifting shorelines. Ecological communities adapted locally, yet the planetary context had altered. The continental puzzle, assembled piece by piece beneath living canopies, introduced variability into a system that had favored stability. Tectonic motion, mountain uplift, and redirected drainage quietly redefined the stage upon which the great forests had thrived. What had seemed a persistent equilibrium between growth and burial began to encounter new constraints imposed not by biology, but by the restless architecture of the earth itself. Change arrived not as a single fracture, but as a gradual tightening of patterns that had long felt stable. The air remained warm in many regions, yet subtle differences accumulated across seasons. Periods of rainfall shortened in certain basins, and intervals of relative dryness lengthened. What had once been persistent saturation began to fluctuate, introducing contrasts that reshaped ecological rhythm. As continental assembly progressed and mountain ranges altered atmospheric circulation, global climate drifted toward greater variability. In the late Carboniferous, evidence from glacial deposits indicates that large ice sheets expanded across portions of the southern supercontinent. These ice age pulses were not continuous, but episodic, advancing and retreating over spans measured in millions of years. Their presence influenced planetary albedo and atmospheric circulation, contributing to cooling trends that reverberated far beyond polar latitudes. Cooling at higher latitudes affected sea level through the storage of water in continental ice. When ice sheets expanded, global sea levels fell, exposing coastal plains and altering the geometry of shallow seas. In equatorial regions, even modest sea level decline could transform the extent of wetlands. Areas that had once lain near the water table became elevated relative to fluctuating shorelines, reducing the persistence of standing water that peat formation required. Seasonality intensified as well. Regions near the equator still received abundant sunlight, yet precipitation patterns grew more uneven. Monsoonal systems may have strengthened in response to continental configurations, producing pronounced wet and dry intervals rather than uniform humidity. During drier phases, water tables dropped, exposing organic rich substrates to increased oxidation. The delicate balance between growth and preservation shifted incrementally. Shrinking tropical wetlands marked one of the most significant ecological responses to this climatic drift. Continuous belts of swamp, fragmented into isolated basins, separated by better drained terrain. Vegetation adapted locally, yet species dependent on constant saturation faced new constraints. As peat accumulation slowed in some areas, the rate of carbon burial declined relative to earlier intervals. These transitions did not extinguish forests immediately. Instead, they introduced patchiness into what had been expanses of near uniform wetland. Fire frequency may have altered in response to drying pulses, while sediment delivery patterns changed as rivers adjusted to new gradients and exposed floodplains. Each adjustment compounded the next, weaving tectonic and climatic influences into ecological outcome. The slow climate shift illustrates how planetary systems respond to cumulative forces, ice growth in distant regions, mountain uplift, and continental rearrangement translated into altered rainfall thousands of kilometers away. Wetlands contracted not because growth ceased entirely, but because the environmental framework that sustained their vast continuity grew less reliable. Over time, this gradual transformation would narrow the domain of the great swamp kingdoms, setting the stage for further ecological turnover. What had once stretched as nearly continuous wetland began to separate into islands of persistence, surrounded by terrain no longer suited to constant saturation. Drainage patterns shifted under the influence of tectonic adjustment and falling sea levels, and the broad equatorial swamps fragmented into disconnected basins. In some regions, peat formation continued, but in others, the water table retreated just enough to alter soil chemistry and exposure. The change was subtle at first, yet cumulative. Habitat fragmentation reshaped ecological networks. Species that had thrived in expansive, uninterrupted marsh found themselves confined to smaller pockets where local conditions remained favorable. Genetic exchange between populations diminished as distances between wetlands increased. Where peat surfaces dried more frequently, oxidation accelerated, and the delicate balance that had favored accumulation tipped toward decay. The dominance of swamp adapted flora weakened. Among the most affected were the giant lycopsids that had defined the earlier forest architecture. Their shallow rooting systems and reproductive strategies were finely tuned to saturated substrates and stable humidity. As seasonal contrasts intensified and drainage improved across broad tracts of land, these towering forms struggled to maintain their former abundance. Fossil records show a decline in diversity and distribution of many lycopsid lineages toward the close of the Carboniferous. Some vanished entirely, leaving only impressions in rock as testimony to their scale. In their place, seed-bearing plants gained prominence. Gymnosperms, with deeper root systems and protective seeds capable of withstanding drier intervals, expanded into habitats less consistently waterlogged. Seeds offered an advantage in environments where moisture could no longer be assumed, enclosing embryonic tissue within resistant coatings that preserved viability through fluctuating conditions. Wood anatomy also evolved toward denser secondary growth, enhancing structural support and resilience. This transition marked a profound ecosystem turnover. Forest composition shifted from spore-dominated communities rooted in peat to more varied assemblages adapted to seasonality. Understories changed, soil profiles diversified, and nutrient cycling adjusted to new balances between growth and decomposition. The visual character of landscapes transformed gradually as towering lycopsid columns gave way to different silhouettes shaped by emerging plant lineages. The collapse of the coal forests was not a singular catastrophe, but a drawn-out reorganization driven by intertwined climatic and tectonic forces. Fragmented wetlands could no longer sustain the vast, continuous peat-forming systems of earlier epochs. As conditions diversified, so did life's strategies. The dominance of one architectural experiment receded, and another advanced, reflecting the ongoing dialogue between Earth's shifting surface and the organisms that sought to root within it. After the vast wetlands fragmented and the dominance of towering lycopsids receded, the architecture of forests began to change in ways that would define all later landscapes. The silhouettes that followed were shaped not by saturated peat and shallow anchorage, but by adaptation to variability. As climates shifted and drainage improved across wide regions, plant lineages capable of enduring seasonal dryness expanded into prominence. Gymnosperms rose steadily during this transition. Their seeds, encased in protective coatings, allowed embryonic plants to withstand periods of limited moisture and disperse across terrain less reliably wet. Reproduction no longer depended solely on free water for fertilization, and this freedom opened ecological spaces that spore-bearing giants had struggled to occupy. Conifers and related groups established themselves in environments where consistency gave way to fluctuation. Root systems deepened in response to these new conditions. Instead of spreading primarily through shallow, saturated layers, many gymnosperms extended roots downward in search of stable water reserves. Taproots and complex branching networks penetrated soils that had matured over millions of years, stabilizing slopes and drawing nutrients from greater depth. This vertical integration with the subsurface provided resilience against drought and mechanical stress. Wood anatomy evolved alongside these changes. Secondary growth became denser and more structurally integrated, with annual increments reflecting seasonal cycles. The vascular tissues of later trees emphasized durability and longevity rather than rapid vertical ascent, supported by comparatively soft interiors. Growth rings recorded climatic variation, and trunks developed the capacity to endure for centuries rather than focusing on swift occupation of space. At the same time, decomposer communities advanced. Fungal lineages capable of efficiently degrading lignin diversified, refining enzymatic pathways that broke down complex plant polymers. As these organisms expanded their ecological roles, the imbalance between production and decay diminished. Dead wood no longer accumulated at the extraordinary rates seen during peak peat formation. Carbon returned to the atmosphere more readily through respiration and microbial processing. This convergence restored a more balanced carbon cycle. While forests continued to influence atmospheric composition, the scale of long-term burial through persistent peat accumulation declined relative to earlier intervals. Carbon sequestration persisted, yet it was integrated within feedback loops that limited prolonged excess. Fire regimes, nutrient cycling, and soil development operated within a system that no longer favored massive, uninterrupted storage of organic matter. The forests that followed retained grandeur, yet their internal logic differed. They were built for endurance across fluctuating climates, anchored by deep roots and supported by dense wood. The peculiar combination of saturated terrain, limited lignin digestion, and rapid vertical growth that had once produced columned giants did not recur in the same form. Evolution moved forward, carrying lessons of structure and chemistry into new expressions that would shape terrestrial ecosystems for the remainder of Earth's history. The sky, once enriched beyond familiar proportions, began a gradual return toward equilibrium. The processes that had elevated oxygen during the height of peat formation no longer operated at the same scale. As vast wetlands contracted and decomposition grew more efficient under evolving fungal communities, the balance between production and decay shifted. Carbon that might previously have been sealed away in saturated basins cycled more readily back into the atmosphere, subtly altering its composition. Atmospheric oxygen declined, not in a sudden plunge, but through extended adjustment. Geochemical proxies, derived from isotope ratios and sedimentary records, indicate a downward trend from the elevated concentrations that had characterized peak Carboniferous intervals. With less organic carbon being buried in immense volumes, the net release of oxygen through photosynthesis was increasingly balanced by respiration and oxidation. The chemical ledger approached a steadier state. This atmospheric moderation carried biological consequences. Insects, whose size had been supported by strong diffusion gradients across tracheal systems, encountered new constraints as oxygen levels fell. The maximum effective distance for passive gas exchange shortened, limiting the feasibility of exceptionally large bodies. Over time, the record reveals a reduction in extreme arthropod gigantism. Dragonflies, no longer spanned such breadth, and massive millipedes receded from prominence. Body plans adjusted to the restored limits imposed by altered air. Fire regimes shifted as well. Combustion thresholds rose relative to peak oxygen phases, reducing the ease with which vegetation ignited under comparable conditions. Although wildfires persisted as ecological agents, their intensity and frequency were modulated by atmospheric chemistry, now closer to modern proportions. The interplay between flame and forest entered a different balance, one less amplified by excess oxidizing potential. These changes reflect broader feedback loops linking vegetation, climate, and atmospheric composition. As seed-bearing plants expanded and ecosystems diversified across more seasonally varied landscapes, patterns of carbon uptake and release became more evenly distributed. Weathering of uplifted mountain ranges continued to draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, influencing global temperature and ice volume. In turn, climatic shifts affected vegetation cover and the rate of organic burial. The stabilization of atmospheric chemistry was not a return to an earlier state, but an emergence of new equilibrium shaped by altered biotic and tectonic conditions. Oxygen levels settled within ranges that would support future evolutionary trajectories without recreating the extraordinary extremes of the swamp-dominated world. Through these intertwined feedbacks, Earth demonstrated its capacity for self-adjustment across geological time, with life acting both as driver and respondent within a dynamic planetary system whose balance continually evolves. In the wake of retreating wetlands and moderating skies, the character of the land shifted toward openness. Forests no longer formed uninterrupted belts of saturation, but arranged themselves within landscapes, increasingly marked by contrast. Between remnant marshes, drier expanses expanded, their soils firming under reduced water tables and more pronounced seasonal cycles. Life adjusted its pace to this new cadence. Early reptiles, once tentative presences along the margins of amphibian domains, diversified with growing confidence. Their amniotic eggs, enclosed within protective membranes and resistant shells, allowed reproduction beyond the immediate reach of standing water. Embryos developed within self-contained environments, insulated from fluctuations in humidity that would have imperiled earlier forms. This innovation freed vertebrate life from strict dependence on swampy habitats and encouraged exploration of upland terrain. Body plans evolved accordingly. Limbs strengthened beneath the body rather than sprawling widely to either side, supporting more efficient movement across firmer ground. Scaled skin reduced water loss, permitting extended activity away from moist refuges. As dry adapted ecosystems spread, reptiles occupied niches that had been inaccessible during the height of peat-dominated forests. Predation patterns shifted, and food webs reorganized around organisms less tethered to saturated substrates. Plant communities mirrored this transformation. Seeds increasingly supplanted spores as the dominant reproductive strategy in many regions. Unlike spores, which required moist conditions for fertilization and establishment, seeds carried stored nutrients and protective coatings that enhanced survival during dry intervals. Wind and gravity dispersed them across diverse terrain, enabling colonization of habitats that fluctuated between wet and dry seasons. Gymnosperms, already ascending during the decline of lycopsids, extended their reach across continents whose interiors were becoming less predictably humid. Under these emerging assemblages, soils developed new characteristics. Organic matter continued to accumulate, yet it cycled more dynamically through decomposition and regrowth. Without the same scale of continuous peat formation, carbon burial occurred in more varied contexts. Fire, moderated by atmospheric composition and vegetation type, remained an ecological influence, but operated within ecosystems structured differently from those of the earlier swamp kingdoms. This era marked the beginning of the road toward the Permian, a period that would bring further climatic fluctuation and biological experimentation. Continental assembly continued, reshaping coastlines and altering ocean circulation. Arid regions expanded in some interiors as supercontinental geometry intensified seasonal extremes. The world that followed the giants was not defined by their absence alone, but by the emergence of new adaptive strategies attuned to variability. From these adjustments, terrestrial ecosystems gained resilience under shifting conditions. Reptiles advanced across drying plains. Seed-bearing plants anchored themselves in diverse soils, and ecological networks recalibrated around landscapes less dominated by waterlogged continuity. The age after the giants unfolded as a quiet reorientation, guiding life toward forms and patterns that would carry it into the deep unfolding of the Permian world. The landscapes that emerged after the retreat of the coal forests did not settle into permanence. Beneath the apparent stability of new woodlands and expanding dry plains, pressures accumulated across interconnected systems. Continental assembly continued its slow convergence, drawing land into a configuration that altered ocean circulation and intensified climatic contrasts between interior and coast. Vast interiors grew more arid as distance from moderating seas increased, and seasonal extremes sharpened under the geometry of the forming supercontinent. This reorganization introduced gradual environmental stressors that rippled outward through atmosphere, hydrology, and biosphere. Fluctuations in sea level exposed continental shelves and then submerged them again, reshaping coastal ecosystems and redistributing sediment. Mountain building enhanced weathering rates, drawing carbon dioxide from the air. Yet volcanic activity associated with tectonic processes intermittently returned greenhouse gases to circulation. The balance between cooling and warming forces oscillated, generating climatic instability rather than sustained equilibrium. Vegetation patterns responded in complex ways. Seed-bearing plants continued their expansion, yet even these adaptable lineages faced shifting moisture regimes and temperature gradients. Regions once buffered by humid continuity experienced longer dry seasons, while others endured episodic flooding tied to altered drainage networks. Soil profiles reflected this variability, alternating between periods of accumulation and erosion. Without the extensive peat-forming systems that had once stabilized carbon cycling, atmospheric composition became more sensitive to disturbance. Biodiversity patterns shifted gradually as ecological networks recalibrated. Some reptile groups diversified, exploring niches opened by fragmentation of earlier habitats. Amphibian lineages, more dependent on moisture, encountered contraction in certain regions. Invertebrate communities adjusted to new vegetation structures and fire regimes, while marine organisms along changing coastlines faced fluctuating salinity and temperature. The system as a whole exhibited resilience, yet its underlying stability had diminished. Long-term instability following the collapse of the coal forests did not manifest as immediate devastation, but as cumulative strain. Each tectonic adjustment, each climatic oscillation, layered additional complexity onto ecosystems already adapting to altered carbon cycles. The assembly of Pangaea intensified continentality, fostering vast arid interiors and influencing atmospheric circulation on a global scale. Ocean basins narrowed, currents reorganized, and nutrient distributions shifted in response. These processes formed a prelude rather than an isolated event. The gradual convergence of stressors set conditions that would culminate in the profound biological crisis marking the end of the Permian. Though that catastrophe lay ahead, its roots extended into the transformations already underway. The Earth system, once shaped by swamp dominated equilibrium, moved toward a new and more volatile configuration in which feedbacks between land, sea, and sky would amplify change on a scale rarely seen before. Stone remembers what landscapes forget. Beneath layers of sediment and within seams of dark carbon, the details of vanished forests persist in mineral form, preserved not as living tissue, but as structure translated into rock. Among the most revealing records are coal balls, rounded concretions embedded within coal deposits, formed when mineral-rich waters infiltrated peat before it fully compacted. Calcium carbonate and other minerals percolated through plant material, infusing cells and stabilizing them before collapse. Under careful preparation, these coal balls yield microscopic sections in which cellular anatomy remains visible, walls and vessels outlined with remarkable fidelity. Within such specimens, researchers can trace vascular bundles, spore producing structures, and patterns of growth that distinguish lycopsids from tree ferns and early seed plants. The internal architecture of trunks, once soft and easily compressed, appears frozen in mineral matrix. Through thin sections examined under magnification, entire tissues reveal themselves, allowing reconstruction of forest composition not merely at the scale of silhouette, but at the level of cellular organization. Elsewhere, impressions in sedimentary rock capture external forms. Petrified bark impressions display the diamond-shaped or columnar patterns that once marked towering trunks. These impressions formed when fallen stems pressed into mud, leaving negative molds that later hardened into stone. Leaf scars, arranged in spiral or vertical sequences, record the attachment points of foliage long vanished. In some strata, trunk molds extend vertically through successive layers, evidence of standing trees buried rapidly by sediment, their forms preserved as hollow casts after organic material decayed. Such fossils provide more than aesthetic remnants. They allow scientists to map the distribution of species across ancient basins, correlating assemblages from one region to another. By analyzing growth rings where present, researchers infer seasonal variation and climatic context. Spore types recovered from coal ball matrices reveal reproductive strategies and community structure. Even the orientation of fallen trunks can suggest prevailing wind directions at the time of burial. Through integration of these lines of evidence, paleobotanists reconstruct entire ecosystems. They estimate canopy height, density of stands, and relationships between undergrowth and dominant forms. Geochemical analysis of associated sediments offers clues about water chemistry and oxygen availability. Charcoal fragments interlayered with plant remains testify to fire events, linking ecological disturbance to preserved anatomy. The forest that once dominated equatorial lowlands is thus reassembled from fragments, each fossil contributing a portion of its structure. No single specimen captures the full complexity, yet together they outline a world of towering forms, saturated soils, and distinctive growth strategies. In the quiet persistence of coal balls, bark impressions, and trunk molds, the vanished architecture of the Carboniferous remains accessible, translated from living tissue into enduring stone. Air leaves no direct fossil, yet its history is written in stone through subtle chemical signatures that endure long after the atmosphere itself has changed. Within sedimentary layers deposited across former wetlands and shallow seas, Ratios of stable isotopes record the movement of carbon through ancient systems. Carbon exists primarily as two stable forms, one slightly heavier than the other, and biological processes discriminate between them during photosynthesis. When vast quantities of organic matter are buried rather than decomposed, the isotopic balance preserved in marine carbonates and terrestrial sediments shifts in measurable ways. By sampling these rocks and analyzing their isotopic composition, geochemists reconstruct fluctuations in carbon burial over time. Elevated burial rates during the height of peat accumulation correspond to shifts consistent with increased atmospheric oxygen production. When organic carbon is sequestered in large volumes, oxygen released during photosynthesis remains in the atmosphere, and isotopic patterns in associated sediments reflect that imbalance. Through careful calibration against modern processes, scientists trace these variations across geological intervals. Charcoal layers offer another line of evidence. Fossilized charcoal forms only when vegetation burns in the presence of sufficient oxygen to sustain combustion. The frequency and distribution of charcoal fragments within sedimentary sequences provide constraints on atmospheric composition. Experimental studies demonstrate that below certain oxygen thresholds, wildfires cannot propagate easily across landscapes. The widespread presence of charcoal during particular intervals suggests oxygen concentrations high enough to support regular burning. Conversely, reductions in charcoal abundance align with declines in atmospheric oxygen inferred from other proxies. Additional indicators arise from mineral oxidation states preserved in ancient soils and marine deposits. Certain iron-bearing minerals record the redox conditions under which they formed, offering indirect insight into atmospheric and oceanic chemistry. Combined with models of volcanic outgassing, weathering rates, and biological productivity, these mineral signatures contribute to a broader reconstruction of past air composition. Estimating ancient oxygen and carbon dioxide levels requires integrating multiple data sets rather than relying on a single measure. Isotope curves, charcoal abundance, paleosol chemistry, and fossil distribution are assembled into coherent frameworks through iterative modeling. Each dataset carries uncertainties, yet together they constrain plausible ranges for atmospheric gases during different periods. For the Carboniferous, converging evidence supports oxygen levels significantly above modern values, followed by a gradual decline as carbon cycling rebalanced. Through these methods, rocks become archives of invisible atmospheres. They preserve not the air itself, but the consequences of its chemistry imprinted in mineral structure and elemental ratios. By reading these signatures with precision and caution, scientists reconstruct the rise and fall of oxygen, revealing how deeply life and lithosphere intertwine in shaping the composition of the sky. If one were to place a modern rainforest beside the coal forests of the Carboniferous, the contrast would be immediate, not in density alone, but in character. Contemporary tropical forests pulse with layered biodiversity woven from flowering plants, vines, hardwood trunks, and an understory rich with grasses and shrubs. Their canopies are irregular mosaics of broad leaves, and their reproduction depends heavily on pollinators, fruits, and intricate ecological exchanges. The ancient forests that once dominated equatorial lowlands operated by a different logic. Those earlier landscapes lacked flowers entirely. No petals open to attract insects. No fruits swelled with seeds designed for animal dispersal. Grasses had not yet evolved, and the familiar texture of meadow or savanna did not exist. Instead, Vertical columns of lycopsids and tree ferns defined the skyline, their crowns often confined to upper reaches, leaving long stretches of trunk bare beneath. The architecture felt rhythmic and repetitive, patterned by scarred bark and segmented stems rather than branching hardwood complexity. Modern rainforests rely heavily on dense wood and intricate branching systems that support heavy leaves and diverse epiphytes. In contrast, many Carboniferous giants invested less in solid timber and more in rapid extension. Their interiors were often lighter in structure, supported by outer tissues reinforced with lignin but not built from the dense secondary growth typical of later trees. Stability emerged from collective density within wetlands rather than from deep, singular anchorage. The understory would have appeared unfamiliar as well. Without flowering shrubs or grasses, ground cover consisted largely of smaller spore-bearing plants and juvenile forms of dominant species. Light filtered through narrow crowns in vertical shafts, illuminating patches of peat-rich substrate rather than a tapestry of broadleaf foliage. Insects moved through this environment, yet the absence of birds and mammals altered the acoustic and behavioral landscape in ways difficult to imagine from a modern vantage point. Despite its alien qualities, this forest was entirely real, rooted in documented fossils and geochemical evidence. Its differences do not render it fantastical, but highlight the diversity of evolutionary solutions shaped by specific climatic and atmospheric contexts. The absence of flowers did not imply ecological simplicity, nor did the dominance of spore-bearing plants limit structural complexity. It was a fully functioning biome, tuned to saturated soils and oxygen-rich air. Comparing it to present rainforests underscores how contingent forest form is upon underlying chemistry and climate. Where modern tropics thrive on pollination networks and dense wood, the Carboniferous wetlands relied on spore clouds and rapid vertical growth. Each forest reflects its era's balance of tectonics, atmosphere, and biological innovation, revealing that the familiar green worlds of today are only one expression within a much broader history of terrestrial life. Silence, in that distant age, carried a different texture. It was not the layered chorus familiar in modern forests, where birds weave complex songs through morning air and mammals rustle through undergrowth. The Carboniferous wetlands held no feathers in their canopy, no fur moving through leaf litter. The acoustic space belonged to other voices, slower and more elemental, shaped by moisture and towering forms. Amphibians contributed some of the most resonant sounds. Their calls, emerging from shallow pools and saturated hollows, were low and rhythmic, adapted to humid air that carried vibrations efficiently across short distances. These vocalizations likely served purposes similar to those of their descendants, signaling territory and readiness to breed within a landscape still closely tied to water. Yet without the overlay of avian song, each call would have traveled with unusual clarity through filtered light and dense humidity. Insects added a continuous undercurrent. Wing beats of large griffinflies and other arthropods generated steady, mechanical hums as they moved between trunks and across open patches. The resonance of broad wings cutting through oxygen-rich air may have produced tones deeper than those of modern dragonflies. Closer to the ground, smaller insects rasped or vibrated appendages against plant surfaces, creating pulses that blended into a persistent background rhythm. The forest did not sing in melodies, but in layered oscillations. Wind moved differently as well. Passing through tall lycopsid columns and the fronds of tree ferns, it encountered a canopy structured by narrow crowns and long stretches of exposed trunk. Instead of the rustling cascade of broad leaves there would have been a more vertical whisper, air sliding along patterned bark and lifting through clustered foliage high above. In wetlands where humidity remained elevated, breezes were often gentle, yet even slight movement stirred the crowns and carried subtle vibrations downward. Rainfall added another dimension. Droplets striking fronds and peat-rich ground produced muted percussion, absorbed quickly by saturated substrate. Water dripping from elevated leaves returned steadily to pools below, reinforcing the cyclical soundscape of moisture. In the absence of mammals trampling undergrowth or birds taking flight, these elemental sounds stood unobstructed. Predation and movement still generated sudden disturbances. A large amphibian shifting through shallow water created ripples and splashes. Arthropods landing against bark produced sharp, transient clicks. Yet, overall, the sound of that world would have felt spacious despite its density, defined by wind, water, and the steady hum of invertebrate motion. This acoustic landscape, stripped of familiar voices, reveals how profoundly different ecosystems can be while remaining entirely terrestrial. The Carboniferous forest spoke through moisture and wingbeat, through breath drawn by scaled and smooth-skinned bodies, and through air that moved among towering trunks without the calls that later ages would come to know. To move through that forest would have required a different sense of footing. The ground, though expansive, was rarely firm in the way modern soils feel beneath steady boots. Peat formed a thick, compressible layer composed of partially preserved plant matter, saturated and dark. Each step would have pressed downward with a slow yielding response, releasing small pockets of water that shimmered briefly before settling back into stillness. Stability existed, yet it was elastic rather than rigid. Beneath the surface, shallow root networks interlaced in dense mats. Instead of penetrating deeply into mineral substrate, many roots spread laterally through the upper layers of organic matter. They intertwined with neighboring systems, forming a living lattice that distributed weight across a broad area. This network provided enough support to sustain towering trunks, yet it also created uneven terrain where depressions and raised hummocks alternated unpredictably. Walking required attention to subtle changes in texture and resistance. Humidity enveloped the body almost immediately. Moisture hung in the air, sustained by constant transpiration and limited evaporation beneath the canopy. Breath would have felt heavy but not oppressive, as warm air carried the scent of wet vegetation and decomposing fragments. Clothing, if worn, would have absorbed dampness quickly. Skin would have registered the closeness of the atmosphere, an intimate contact between organism and environment. Light reached the forest floor in measured streams. Crowns clustered high above, allowing shafts of illumination to descend between columns of bark patterned with leaf scars. These beams shifted with the movement of the sun, creating pools of brightness amid broader dimness. The absence of broadleaf layers meant that shadows were elongated rather than diffuse, stretching vertically across trunks and peat. Reflections from standing water added a muted shimmer to the understory. Movement through such terrain would have been unhurried. Each step sank slightly before finding equilibrium, and sudden changes in water depth could alter footing without warning. Amphibians slipped silently from shallow pools at the disturbance of approach, while insects rose and settled again with measured wing beats. The environment demanded adaptation to its softness and density rather than to obstacles of wood or stone. Yet, within this yielding landscape, there was coherence. The shallow anchorage of the giants, the saturation of the soil, and the filtered light formed a unified system shaped by climate and chemistry. To walk there would have been to inhabit a world where vertical ambition rose from ground that never fully hardened, where humidity softened edges, and where the scale of trunks above contrasted with the pliant surface below, binding the experience of height to the quiet persistence of peat. Beyond the boundaries of any single swamp or forest stand, the influence of these ancient ecosystems extended outward into the architecture of the planet itself. Photosynthesis, operating at extraordinary scale, withdrew vast quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, transferring it into living tissue and, through persistent burial, into long-term storage. As carbon accumulated beneath sediment in peat-rich basins, the atmospheric reservoir diminished relative to earlier intervals. This shift altered radiative balance, influencing how much heat the planet retained. Carbon dioxide functions as a greenhouse gas, trapping infrared radiation and moderating global temperature. When its concentration declines over extended spans, the capacity of the atmosphere to retain heat is reduced. During the late Carboniferous, evidence from glacial deposits indicates that significant ice sheets expanded across portions of the southern supercontinent. While tectonic factors and continental positioning contributed to this cooling, extensive carbon burial by forests amplified the trend. The removal of greenhouse gases through organic sequestration supported conditions favorable to glaciation. This interaction illustrates the depth of Earth system feedback loops. Plant growth, driven by sunlight and nutrient availability, influenced atmospheric composition. Atmospheric composition, in turn, shaped climate patterns that affected precipitation, ice volume, and sea level. Fluctuating sea levels then altered the extent of wetlands and the capacity for further peat formation. Each component fed into the next, forming a network of reciprocal influence rather than a linear chain of cause and effect. As cooling progressed, glacial expansion locked water into continental ice, lowering sea levels and modifying coastal configurations. Reduced sea levels exposed additional land surfaces, potentially altering weathering rates and nutrient fluxes. Chemical weathering of uplifted terrains continued to draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, reinforcing cooling tendencies. Meanwhile, volcanic activity intermittently reintroduced greenhouse gases, creating oscillations within the broader trend. Life did not merely respond to these changes, it participated in shaping them. The structural chemistry of plants, particularly lignin-rich tissues resistant to decay, allowed carbon to be stored efficiently within geological strata. Microbial communities, constrained by environmental conditions, influenced how much of that carbon returned to the air. The combined effect of biological innovation and ecological imbalance altered atmospheric chemistry on a planetary scale. Through these processes, forests became agents of climate modulation. Their collective metabolism and burial practices contributed to long-term shifts in temperature and ice distribution. The Carboniferous demonstrates that life can act as a geological force, modifying the composition of the sky and the thermal state of the Earth over millions of years. In this sense, the towering plants of that era were not only inhabitants of a climate, but participants in its construction, weaving biological activity into the chemical fabric of the planet. For hundreds of millions of years, the carbon drawn down by those ancient forests remained sealed beneath layers of stone, isolated from the atmosphere that once received it. Pressure and heat transformed buried peat into coal, concentrating the chemical energy of long, vanished sunlight within black seams that lay silent beneath shifting continents. This stored carbon represented a vast interruption in the planetary cycle, a pause measured not in centuries but in geological ages. When humans began to mine these deposits, they reopened that ancient ledger. During the Industrial Revolution, coal extracted from Carboniferous strata became a primary fuel for expanding industry. Steam engines, furnaces, and later electrical generation systems relied on the combustion of material formed in swamps that had vanished long before mammals emerged. The energy released during burning originated from photosynthesis that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago, compressed and preserved until rediscovered by technological societies. Combustion reversed the burial process. Carbon locked in coal combined with oxygen in the air, producing carbon dioxide and releasing stored energy as heat. This reaction, simple in chemistry yet vast in scale, reintroduced into the atmosphere carbon that had been removed during the height of peat formation. The rate of release, however, differed profoundly from the pace of original sequestration. What accumulated gradually over immense spans was returned within centuries. The industrial era accelerated this transfer. Coal fueled railways, steel production, and urban expansion. As extraction intensified, additional fossil fuels derived from ancient biomass, including petroleum and natural gas, joined the energy mix. Each represented stored carbon from earlier biological productivity, liberated through combustion and oxidation. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations rose in response, altering the radiative balance of the planet. The climate implications of this shift are grounded in the same principles that once enabled cooling during the Carboniferous. Increased greenhouse gas concentrations enhance the atmosphere's capacity to retain heat. Global temperature trends reflect this altered balance, influencing precipitation patterns, ice distribution, and ocean chemistry. The feedback loops that once linked plant growth and carbon burial now operate in reverse, as rapid carbon release drives warming rather than cooling. The hidden cost of ancient forests lies not in their existence, but in their reactivation as fuel. By tapping into geological reservoirs of carbon, modern society has reconnected atmospheric chemistry to ecosystems that thrived under very different conditions. The coal seams beneath cities and mountains are not merely mineral resources, they are fragments of a distant biosphere whose long sealed carbon has become an active participant in contemporary climate dynamics. Memory in the geological record often favors sudden violence over gradual transformation. Asteroid impacts leave iridium layers, mass extinctions carve sharp boundaries into strata, volcanic catastrophes stain sediments with abrupt chemical signatures. The end of the coal forests did not unfold with a single, unmistakable scar. Instead, it dissolved across extended intervals, marked by contraction, replacement, and slow reorganization rather than instant devastation. There is no singular horizon in the rocks announcing the disappearance of towering lycopsids. Their decline is recorded as thinning assemblages, shifting species distributions, and altered sediment patterns. Wetlands fragment, peat accumulation, wanes in certain basins, and gymnosperms rise into prominence. The transformation is visible to those who study it closely, yet it lacks the dramatic punctuation that often anchors public imagination. Without a catastrophic boundary layer or a sudden collapse of global biodiversity, this age recedes quietly into deep time. Later chapters of Earth's history command more attention. The rise of dinosaurs, their dominance across Mesozoic landscapes, and their abrupt extinction form narratives shaped by spectacle and finality. Fossils of massive reptiles capture imagination in ways that petrified bark impressions rarely do. The Carboniferous forests, though immense in scale and planetary impact, are overshadowed by creatures whose forms appear more immediately dramatic to modern eyes. Yet the absence of a sudden catastrophe does not diminish significance. The slow transition from swamp dominated equilibrium to more varied, seasonally structured ecosystems altered atmospheric chemistry, climate feedbacks, and evolutionary pathways. Carbon buried during that era continues to influence energy systems and climate today. The structural innovations of vascular plants, lignin rich tissues, and seed development laid foundations for all subsequent terrestrial ecosystems. This age is foundational precisely because it operated through accumulation rather than spectacle. It demonstrates how incremental shifts in climate, tectonics, and biological capability can reconfigure planetary systems without a singular moment of collapse. The coal seams beneath modern cities and mountain ranges are physical remnants of that transformation, reminders that vast environmental change can unfold through patience rather than explosion. In the broader narrative of Earth's history, the Carboniferous stands as a hinge between early terrestrial experimentation and later ecological complexity. Its forests shaped atmospheric composition, influenced glacial intervals, and stored carbon that would re-emerge in industrial times. Though lacking the dramatic marker of a mass extinction boundary, this era remains embedded within the chemistry of the present atmosphere and the structure of modern landscapes. Its quiet transition is not a footnote, but a foundation woven into the long continuity of life reshaping the planet. Even with coal seams, fossil trunks, and isotopic curves laid out across laboratories and field sites, the Carboniferous remains a landscape of active inquiry. Its broad outlines are well established, yet within those contours lie uncertainties that continue to invite refinement. Science approaches this era not as a closed chapter, but as a conversation still unfolding through new methods and deeper sampling. One enduring discussion concerns the exact peak of atmospheric oxygen. Geochemical proxies suggest concentrations significantly higher than modern levels, perhaps approaching the low to mid 30s in percent. Yet precise values depend on model assumptions and the calibration of multiple datasets. Charcoal abundance, isotopic ratios, and mineral oxidation states all contribute pieces of evidence, but each carries margins of uncertainty. Slight differences in interpretation can shift estimates by several percentage points, and such variations matter when considering combustion thresholds and biological constraints. The timing of fungal evolution capable of efficient lignin degradation also remains under examination. Molecular clock analyses, fossilized fungal structures, and biochemical studies converge toward a general window, yet debates persist about how rapidly these decomposers diversified and how fully they penetrated peat-forming ecosystems. Some researchers argue that white rot fungi expanded significantly after peak coal deposition, reinforcing the idea of a temporary imbalance. Others propose a more gradual coevolution between plants and decomposers, suggesting that environmental context amplified preservation even where enzymatic capacity existed. Climate triggers represent another area of nuanced investigation. While tectonic assembly toward a supercontinent, mountain building, and weathering feedbacks are broadly accepted influences, the relative weight of each factor in driving late Carboniferous cooling continues to be refined. Glacial deposits, paleosol data, and sedimentary sequences provide evidence for oscillating ice sheets. Yet, integrating these signals into coherent global models requires assumptions about ocean circulation and atmospheric dynamics that are continually updated as computational tools improve. Questions also persist about regional variability. Not all basins recorded identical histories of peat accumulation or forest decline. Local tectonics, sediment supply, and hydrology shaped outcomes in ways that complicate global generalization. As new sites are explored and analytical techniques become more precise, patterns once thought uniform reveal subtle diversity. This ongoing research does not weaken the narrative of the Carboniferous, it enriches it. Each refinement clarifies how life, climate, and tectonics intertwined across deep time. The debates underscore the complexity of reconstructing ancient atmospheres and ecosystems from fragmentary records. In laboratories and field camps, scientists continue to probe coal balls, analyze isotopes, and model feedback loops, not to overturn the broad story, but to sharpen its resolution, ensuring that our understanding of that towering world remains as dynamic as the planet that produced it. Beneath pavement and foundations, beneath steel frameworks and illuminated streets, there are layers of compressed peat that once formed living landscapes. They rest silently below cities and farmland, below rail lines and river ports, as dark seams folded into sedimentary rock. These deposits are not abstract resources. They are the altered remains of trunks, spores, and leaves that rose toward a distant sky long before mammals walked the land. Within each fragment of coal lies ancient sunlight. Photons captured through photosynthesis were woven into cellulose and lignin, fixed into tissue that resisted decay, and slowly buried by shifting sediments. Over immense spans of time, pressure and geothermal warmth reorganized those carbon bonds, concentrating the stored energy into dense, black stone. When that coal is burned, the light of a vanished forest is released again, transformed into heat, motion, and electricity. Modern civilization has drawn deeply from those reserves. Factories, locomotives, and power stations have relied upon carboniferous deposits, converting compressed plant matter into the energy that fueled industrial growth. The connection is rarely visible at street level, yet it persists in the background of infrastructure and industry. The engines of expansion have often been powered by forests that no longer stand. This continuity carries a quiet truth. Life does not merely adapt to planetary conditions, it reshapes them. The coal forests altered atmospheric composition, influenced glacial cycles, and reorganized carbon pathways in ways that still echo. By locking vast quantities of carbon underground, they cooled the planet and set the stage for new evolutionary experiments. By releasing that carbon in recent centuries, humanity has adjusted those balances once more, participating in feedback loops first written in deep time. The story of those forests is not only about towering trunks or giant insects, it is about the capacity of biological processes to transform geology and climate. It is about the accumulation of small acts of growth that, multiplied across continents and ages, recalibrate the chemistry of air and ocean. The coal beneath our feet is evidence that ecosystems can leave signatures lasting hundreds of millions of years. Earth has been stranger than memory suggests. There were epochs when trees rose on spongy tissues without true wood, when dragonflies spanned distances that seem improbable today, when wetlands stretched across equatorial lowlands in humid continuity. Those landscapes are gone, yet their influence endures in rock layers and atmospheric traces. Standing on modern ground, it is possible to imagine solidity as permanence. The deeper record tells another story, one of transformation layered upon transformation. Forests become stone, stone becomes fuel, fuel becomes flame, flame becomes change. The cycle is neither simple nor abrupt, but continuous. Beneath cities and quiet suburbs alike, The compressed remains of ancient growth remind us that life once lifted itself higher than we remember, and in doing so, altered the entire planet.